Picture this. No cities, no courtrooms, no written laws, no kings, no concept of mercy as a virtue worth practicing. Just open wilderness, rival tribes, and the terrifying reality that if your enemy captured you alive, your nightmare was only just beginning. We love to comfort ourselves with a very specific lie. The lie goes something like this. Cruelty is modern. Torture is a product of corrupt governments, deranged politicians, and the festering darkness that only comes with advanced civilization. Primitive humans were simple, innocent, just people living peacefully under open skies, following animals, painting harmless stick figures on cave walls, staying warm by small fires. It is a beautiful story. It is also completely, archaeologically, devastatingly wrong. The dirt does not lie. And for the past several decades, archaeologists have been pulling things out of that dirt that should permanently, irrevocably shatter that comfortable illusion. What they found was not random battlefield violence. What they found was calculated, deliberate, ritualized. A system of inflicting maximum pain, maximum humiliation, and maximum psychological terror. Developed thousands of years before any empire ever existed. Let us start in France. Not modern France with its wine and architecture and romantic boulevards. We are going back 6,300 years to what is now northeastern France, a region called Alsace. And here, archaeologists made a discovery so disturbing that the researchers who published it in the journal Science Advances used words like unprecedented intensity of violence and systematic dehumanization. They found pits, mass graves, and inside those graves, the tangled, broken, mutilated remains of exactly 82 individuals. But here is where it stops being archaeology and starts being horror. These people were not simply killed in battle and dumped. The bones tell a far darker story. The lower limbs of many victims were deliberately, methodically fractured, not from combat, but before death. The researchers confirmed this. Legs broken specifically to prevent escape. These were not soldiers who died fighting. These were prisoners, captured, hobbled, made completely helpless before what came next, and what came next was public. The burial pits were located in the center of the settlement. Not hidden, not shameful. Right in the middle of where the community lived, ate, and gathered. The torture and mutilation were not private acts of cruelty. They were performances. Community spectacles. The entire village watched. Perhaps the entire village participated. The most chilling detail? The left arms. Dozens of victims had their left arms violently severed. Not cleanly. The cut marks on the bones show repeated hacking blows from crude stone axes. These were not surgical amputations. They were brutal, exhausting, deliberate acts that took time. And those severed arms were not buried with the bodies. They were taken, kept as trophies, war prizes carried home by victorious warriors. Think about what that means for the person still alive when it happened. You are a prisoner. Your legs are already broken. You cannot run. You cannot fight. You are surrounded by enemies and watched by an entire community that views your suffering as a celebration. And then someone raises a stone axe. The researchers believe these victims came from rival groups, outsiders, invaders from the Paris Basin pushing into northeastern France during a period of intense territorial conflict. Climate instability had triggered massive population movements. Resources were scarce. And when two competing tribes clashed, the losers did not simply die. They were transformed into living, then dying, demonstrations of what happens to enemies. This was not mindless savagery. This was a message, now across the world entirely. Ancient American Southwest, a site with a deeply ironic name, Sacred Ridge. You hear Sacred Ridge, and you imagine spiritual gatherings, desert sunsets, quiet ceremony. What archaeologists actually found there was something researchers described as a house of horrors. The remains of men, women, and children. Over 14,000 bone fragments representing at least 33 individuals, and the trauma patterns on those bones told a story of something very specific, very deliberate, and deeply terrifying. Hobbling. If you capture enemy warriors and you need them alive, but you cannot risk them escaping, what do you do without chains, without prison cells, without any of the infrastructure of civilization? You use the human body against itself. You take a heavy blunt stone and you destroy the ankles, methodically, intentionally. The skeletal evidence at Sacred Ridge shows extreme, localized trauma concentrated exclusively on the lower legs and feet. The precise, repeated damage of deliberate crippling. These prisoners were not killed quickly. They were broken, permanently, forced to drag themselves across the ground on shattered bones, completely dependent on the very people who destroyed them. The psychological dimension of this is almost more disturbing than the physical reality. A dead prisoner is a problem solved. A living, broken prisoner is something else entirely. It is a demonstration, a warning to other captives, a daily breathing monument to the power of the tribe that captured them. Every single morning, those prisoners woke up in agony and were reminded, in the most visceral way possible, that they were completely, permanently, utterly owned. But France and Sacred Ridge are not the darkest chapters in this story. For that, we need to travel further back. 18,000 years ago. The peak of the last ice age. Poland. Survival at this point in human history was not guaranteed. Resources were catastrophically scarce. Winters lasted months. Starvation was not a fear. It was a constant, lurking reality. And when rival groups clashed under these conditions, the violence that followed crossed into territory that modern humans find almost impossible to process. Archaeologists excavating Mazika Cave in Poland found 53 human bones belonging to at least 10 individuals, 6 adults and 4 children. Advanced microscopic analysis confirmed deliberate post-mortem processing. Skulls cracked open, brains extracted, ears removed, jaws separated from skulls. The bones were mixed with butchered animal remains, processed with the same efficiency, the same tools, the same methodology. This was not burial. This was not ritual in any spiritual sense. This was warfare cannibalism, the systematic consumption of defeated enemies. And the evidence suggests something even darker than the act itself. The victims were not killed quickly before processing began. The trauma patterns indicate they were alive for parts of what happened to them, which raises a question that the bones cannot fully answer. And that is perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. How long did they know what was coming? That question has no clean answer. But what the archaeological record does tell us, with uncomfortable, undeniable clarity, is that across human history, on opposite sides of the planet, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, different civilizations independently arrived at the same conclusion. Suffering, when performed publicly, is power, and no civilization understood this more efficiently, more deliberately, or more terrifyingly than Rome. We need to talk about what happened every single morning in the Roman Colosseum. Not the gladiator fights. Those came in the afternoon, after lunch, as the main event. What happened in the morning was something Romans casually referred to as the halftime show. Something so normalized, so woven into the daily fabric of Roman life, that citizens would arrive early specifically to get good seats. It was called damnatio ad bestias, condemnation by wild beasts. Here is how it worked. Prisoners of war, criminals, and enemies of the Roman state were held in underground cells beneath the arena floor. They spent their final hours in complete darkness, listening to the sounds above them. The crowd filing in, the noise building, the anticipation of 50,000 Romans settling into their seats. Some prisoners knew exactly what was waiting for them. Historical accounts confirm that the night before their scheduled execution, some chose death on their own terms. A German prisoner, documented by the Roman philosopher Seneca, forced a communal lavatory sponge down his own throat rather than face what the morning would bring. Another prisoner thrust his own head between the spokes of a moving cartwheel, deliberately breaking his own neck in the holding area. These were not acts of cowardice. These were men making a rational calculation about what was preferable to what Rome had planned. The trapdoors in the arena floor would open. Starved lions. Bears captured from the Scottish Highlands. leopards shipped from Africa, crocodiles from the Nile. Rome's empire was so vast, its logistics so sophisticated, that it could import exotic death from every corner of the known world, specifically for these morning shows. The animals had been deliberately kept without food for days. They were not simply released into the arena. They were engineered to be at the absolute peak of their desperation and aggression. The prisoners entered the arena with nothing. No weapons, no armor, barefoot on white sand, blinking in the sudden harsh sunlight, surrounded by 50,000 people who had paid for the privilege of watching them die. And here is the detail that makes this uniquely Roman in its cruelty. The crowd did not simply watch in horrified silence. They placed bets. They laughed. They kept score. Historical accounts describe Romans wagering on which prisoner would die first, which animal would make the kill, and which unfortunate soul would manage to survive longest before the inevitable end. The execution of prisoners was not a somber act of state justice. It was morning entertainment, a warm-up act, something to enjoy before lunch. The Romans imported animals from as far as Scotland and sub-Saharan Africa, specifically for these shows. Historians believe the games were responsible for the complete regional extinction of lions across North Africa. The scale of death, human and animal, was so industrialized, so relentlessly systematic, that it reshaped entire ecosystems. But even Rome, with all its engineering and spectacle and 50,000 screaming witnesses, was not the apex of what humans are capable of inflicting on their prisoners. For that, we go to the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan, modern-day Mexico City. And we need to understand something crucial before we go further. The Aztecs did not torture prisoners of war out of rage or cruelty or sadism in the conventional sense. What they did was far more disturbing than that. They did it because they genuinely, cosmologically believed the survival of the entire universe depended on it. In Aztec theology, the sun required human blood to rise every morning, not symbolically, literally. If the sacrifices stopped, the sun would stop. The world would end. Every prisoner of war captured on the battlefield was not an enemy to be punished. They were fuel. Sacred, necessary, cosmically essential fuel, which is why the Aztecs treated their prisoners extraordinarily well before killing them. Prisoners captured in battle were fed, housed, kept healthy for months before their scheduled sacrifice. Because a sick, malnourished prisoner was an inadequate offering. The gods deserved the best. And the best meant a healthy, strong, fully conscious human being at the peak of physical condition. When the day arrived, the prisoner was dressed in ceremonial clothing, given ritual food, walked up the steps of the Templo Mayor, the Great Pyramid at the center of Tenochtitlan, surrounded by priests, accompanied by music, moving steadily toward an altar at the very top that was visible to the entire city below. The prisoner was placed on a curved stone altar, their back arched, chest exposed to the sky. 4 priests held the limbs. A 5th stood above with an obsidian blade, volcanic glass, sharper than any surgical steel used in modern operating rooms. The cut opened the chest, the hands reached inside, and the heart, still beating, still pumping, still alive in the most visceral biological sense, was lifted from the chest cavity and held toward the sun. Archaeologists excavating the Templo Mayor found over 7,000 human bone fragments in sacrificial contexts. They discovered the tzompantli, the Great Skull Rack, a structure the size of a basketball court, standing 4 to 5 meters high, constructed entirely from the skulls of sacrifice victims. Spanish conquistadors estimated it held 130,000 skulls. Modern archaeological evidence confirms the structure was real. The scale was massive, and the skulls belonged overwhelmingly to young men between 20 and 35. Prime warriors, captured in battle, kept alive just long enough to be worthy of the gods. The priests worked in shifts because the killing was exhausting. Historical accounts describe the king himself beginning the sacrifices, cutting open chests until his arms gave out, then passing the obsidian blade to his second in command, who continued until he too tired, and so on down the line. until hundreds of prisoners had been processed in a single ceremony. Processed. That is the word that sits in your chest after you understand what the Aztecs built. Not monsters, not savages. A civilization of extraordinary sophistication, astronomers, architects, engineers, farmers, who looked at captured prisoners of war and saw not people, but maintenance requirements for a universe that demanded blood to keep running. The dirt does not lie. Neither does the stone. Neither do the 130,000 skulls that once stared down from a rack in the middle of the most advanced city in the Western Hemisphere, watching, silently, as the next prisoner walked up the steps.